So, in the month of February, it's been sort of a quiet month. I don't have anything planned for the future. I went to the Goodwill a couple of times. I went to my local library sale here in Indianapolis, um, which is nice because I don't have to drive there. Normally, gasoline is a big expense that I have to consider. But going to the local library sale, it's $1.75 for the bus ride there. Similar amount for the bus ride back. So $3 is a transportation, or $3 and change is a transportation expense, rather than paying $25 to fill up a car. But all the way back at the first of the month, I went to an interesting estate sale in Dayton. I'm willing to drive for estate sales that have interesting books and lots of books because, the price of gasoline is amortized over all of the books that you buy there. And I saw from the pictures there that this guy had like four relatively tall bookshelves in his basement, and the description of the estate sale said he had been interested in local history, Civil War history, that kind of thing. So I drove to Dayton. Indeed, it was a very interesting sale, and I thought I'd focus on one particular theme, which were his books on Native American history. So the first thing is he had not the complete set, but many books of the Handbook of North American Indians. This is a series put out by the Smithsonian. This is one of two books that they have about Indians of the Southwest. The series, there are some books that are on particular themes. So one book I have is Volume 4, History of Indian-White Relations. That's on a particular theme. But then they divided Canada, the United States, and some parts of northern Mexico up into different regions, and then they have books on each region, the Northeast, the Southeast, Arctic, subarctic, the Pacific Northwest, California, Southwest, and so on. And these are cool volumes. A handbook is, a monograph would be an academic book that's advancing an original thesis and trying to prove that thesis through argumentation, whereas a handbook is more of a synthesis of the state of general knowledge. They're usually edited collections, like these ones are. And it's a very interesting series put out by the Smithsonian, as I said. There were originally planned to be 20, but there are only 17. Some of the books that were meant to cover specific themes didn't get made, but they did cover all of the culture regions, I believe. So there's also a series called the Handbook of Middle American Indians, which covers Mexico, like Mesoamerica more, and Central America. And before that, there was the Handbook of South American Indians, which was, I believe, the inspiration for these two other series, because that one came out earlier, and work on it and publication started all the way back in the 40s. I wonder if they're ever going to update it, because there's lots of new archaeological work. Like I think the modern conception of what the Amazon region was like before Columbus has completely changed due to new archaeological work. But anyway, these are very interesting books. They're edited collections of stuff on different topics by scholars who are the experts on the field. Abundantly illustrated with maps, and there's all sorts of different disciplinary focuses: anthropology, linguistics, history, folklore. Sorry, those are my glasses falling to the floor. As well as archaeology. And in the time that I've had these, it didn't take me. It took me a couple of days after I got it to upload it. So from the beginning of February to towards the end of February here, I've already sold 3 of these books. So something that's both Native American history and local history is he had these 2 volumes that are about the reconstruction of a 12th century Native American village. I believe this is what they call Watch Indian Village. Yes, indeed, Watch Indian Village, which is a site near Dayton, Ohio. I believe today there are interpretive stuff there, so you can actually visit it. So obviously, this ties into the local history since it was near Dayton, and you can see the sort of archaeological drawings and reconstructions of buildings that are on the site. It's very interesting stuff. What this is I think I'd like to talk about the Fort Ancient culture. So this site, like many older archaeological sites in Ohio, belongs to something called the Fort Ancient culture. It's not something I'm an expert in, but I find it interesting, and I looked it up because of these books. So to start off with, Fort Ancient culture, this is one of these archaeological terms. So when archaeologists excavate stuff that comes from a time period and a culture where there's not contemporary written evidence, they take a certain bundle of, material culture. So specific kinds of tools like flint knives, pottery, building styles, and if there's different sites that have a similarity in the styles of any of those kinds of things, they call it a culture, and it's usually named after an archaeological site. In this case, Fort Ancient in Ohio, which is funny because Fort Ancient, if I remember correctly, is a multi-period site. So some of the stuff from there is not actually from the Fort Ancient culture. It's not a name that any of the people who actually lived in the Fort Ancient culture would recognize. And you can't really know if they even consider themselves to be a single ethnic group or something like that. But the Fort Ancient culture, I believe, it starts sort of more in what in Europe it would be contemporaneous with the early Middle Ages, and it extends all the way up until the mid 18th century, like circa 1750. Obviously, it's not like 1749 everything was one way, and then 1751 everything's different. But that's sort of the range. So it's contemporaneous or overlaps with the Mississippian culture, which is famous for its mound building. And the Fort Ancient people also did ceremonial mound building. They're also known for villages that were sort of, the houses would be in a circle around a central plaza. And that's one of the distinctive things. And I believe Sunwatch Village was like that, where it was a circle of houses around a central plaza. So one of the interesting things is that sort of the debate around the connection of the Fort Ancient culture to Native American groups that are known from historical sources in the 18th century and indeed still exist today. So I mentioned, of course, that Fort Ancient is an archaeological term for like a certain set of like similar material cultures. But there's no written evidence from that culture itself describing itself. But it does, the material culture continues relatively late, like I said, into the 18th century. But the later part of that is a period of a lot of turmoil. So one of the things that really affects the history and our knowledge of Native American history in the Americas is European diseases can precede, sometimes by quite a long time, European travelers. Because of trade contacts, even if Europeans are only describing Native Americans that they meet on the coasts, Native American groups far in the interior can be devastated by diseases like smallpox and measles. other, European Old World diseases, because the Europeans introduce it to one group of Native Americans, and then it goes to the next group and the next group and the next group. Um, Meaning that by the time Europeans arrive and write about what they notice about an area, um, it can be heavily depopulated. Not that everyone has died, but the landscape is just emptier than it would have been before. So there are French travelers in the 17th, I believe, and definitely by the 18th century, who are going into the area where the Fort Ancient culture lived. And so obviously it's Ohio, but also neighboring parts of Indiana, Kentucky, West Virginia, etc. Um, and they travel into this area, and they do indeed describe finding abandoned villages. There are people still living there, but it's just obviously that much more people used to live there. The other thing is that in the Great Lakes region and the Midwest, including parts of Ohio, in the 17th century, there was a really devastating event called the Beaver Wars, which I won't go into fully here, but basically the Iroquois, who live up in upstate New York and sort of the St. Lawrence River region of Canada that's right nearby there, they would range and sort of raid into the Great Lakes region and the Midwest, both to take people back from that region as captives. So then they would grow up and be part of the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee or the Five Nations, since at that period the Tuscarora hadn't come up. So it's still the Five Nations, not the Six Nations. But anyway, whatever you call them, that league or confederacy of the Five Nations, people would grow up as part of one of those Five Nations, and then therefore strengthen that group, even if they'd originally been a captive from somewhere else. And then, of course, the other thing is to chase people out of the Midwest, or the more easterly Great Lakes part of the Midwest. So then, therefore, that people from the Five Nations could travel into that area to hunt, to trap beavers for furs, which is why it's called the Beaver War. And therefore, there's no competition for those resources with the people who lived there previously. And so this is a very devastating event. And so with that, and also the European diseases, the later period of the Fort Ancient culture is we have enough knowledge to know that it was a period of great turmoil in the region, but we don't have enough direct written evidence to, know lots of things that we would like to know. But there is both, from descriptions of some French travelers as well as from oral Native American histories, there are basically two candidates for people who are descendants of the Fort Ancient culture today. One would be the Shawnee, a well-known Native American group, speakers of an Algonquin language, who would have lived sort of in that area. And the other are speakers of Eastern Siouan languages, which unfortunately are not actually all that well attested. So there's a big language family that's Siouan. I mean, it itself is part of a larger language family called the Siouan-Catawban language family. And so famously, the Sioux on the Great Plains, like the Lakota, the Dakota, and so forth, are one part of that group. Other, cultures like the Mandans also speak related Siouan languages, but there's also Eastern languages that are part of the Siouan family. And from the French, we know that there are people in Ohio who spoke Siouan languages, and actually through all the chaos, some of them wind up migrating down to Louisiana. And it's actually in the very early 20th century that someone actually went and visited the group, and unfortunately did not collect enough information to permit actually a full reconstruction of this language, Ofo, this Eastern Siouan language. but enough information to definitively identify it as a Siouan language. Um, so we know that in the 18th century there were Siouan languages being spoken in Ohio. From French accounts, they named the tribes and so forth. Um, and we know that during that same time period in that region, there was also the Fort Ancient material culture was continuing, and people, of course, have tried to go back and try and find, like pieces of visual art that come from Fort Ancient sites and say, if we know stuff about broader Siouan culture, what might this art mean? But there's nothing that's completely definitive. And the last point I wanted to make, and it's sort of dangerous because I'm not an expert in this area, but it's possible for there to be two cultures, or one material culture in terms of like what pottery they're using, how they build their villages, that are also different in other ways, like what languages they speak. So a great example of this is we know from a much more written about time period, like the 19th century on the Great Plains. On the Great Plains, you have groups like the Sioux, who speak a Siouan language. You have groups like the Cheyenne, who speak an Algonquin language. You have the Comanche, who speak a language that's related to Shoshone. But they all, although have different cultures in many respects, they all share the horse riding, the hunting of the horse from the hunting of the buffalo from the horse, the nomadism, the teepees constructed out of a buffalo. And so, although they all speak languages that are not related, that come from different language families, but they do have certain similar cultural traits. Not all of their cultural traits, but they live in the same landscape, they have the same resources available to them, and they're all in contact with each other. I mean, they literally have a sign language that they use to communicate, because it's a neutral ground that's different that's not based on one particular of their spoken languages, which is another like interesting, cool linguistic thing. Is there's a plain sign language that's not based on any spoken Native American language, that all of the different Native American groups, as well as white, French Canadian or American fur trappers or whatever, could learn to use to communicate without a common spoken language. Sorry, but that's a tangent. But the point is, lots of cultural features in common, but they don't speak similar languages, or that all of the individual groups I've named represent different language families. So it's quite possible, and like I'm not an expert in this, and it's quite possible that more recent stuff than what I've read has come out that has a more definitive interpretation. But I just like to say, two groups could construct their villages similarly and so forth, but still speak two different languages. So not to take a historical question and shrug and say, why not both? But it is an interesting possibility. And the other thing is that you don't want to like if the Shawnee say that they have a connection to this historical culture, I think nowadays academics are more receptive to that, unless old 19th or early 20th century academics who are like, well, yes, but we know better or whatever. But it's a very interesting issue, and these are very interesting books that I must admit, I want to say I haven't read it all the way through, so I can't pretend to be an expert. But you've got to love these archaeological stuff. Like, clearly, I mean, it looks like maybe it was printed, but it looks like it was typewritten. Maybe it's just the font. And I'm trying to see if they've got like a cool image I can end on. One of those reconstructed. Well, this is very relevant. You always got a cool map. So, partial listing of known Fort Ancient sites. And it's cool because they've got the states labeled but they don't really have a lot of this. They have the dashed lines for the state borders, but they've drawn the rivers. So you sort of get an idea of the landscape without, modern American political units. So anyway, once again, mainly a ramble about books that I think are cool. So thanks for listening, and have a good night.